You think you're brave enough to listen? These stories, they won't just fade away when the audio ends. They'll crawl into your mind, waiting for the perfect moment. When you find yourself alone in the woods, every crack of a branch, every shadow lurking among the trees will remind you of what you heard here. Are you ready? Because after this, the forest will never feel the same again. I grew up in a small, forgotten town, hidden deep within the dense forests of Oregon. Here, the towering trees loomed like ancient sentinels, and the sound of the night, the whispers of the wind, the soft creaking of the woods, became the very breath of life. The forest held secrets, ones the locals spoke of only in hushed tones, tales of wandering spirits, elusive creatures, and things too terrifying to be named after dusk. My grandmother was always stern with her warnings, her voice heavy with urgency. Never respond if someone calls your name in the woods. And if you ever hear whistling at night, lock your doors and don't look outside. It's a sign of something evil. As a child, I brushed off these stories as nothing more than scare tactics to keep kids from wandering into the thick, unforgiving wilderness. After all, it was easy to get lost out there, and danger came in many forms. But one fateful night shattered that belief, making me realize some warnings should never be ignored. After my parents passed away, my older brother was all I had left. I spent years scraping together enough money to leave the city behind, desperate for solitude and a fresh start. I bought a cheap, 2-acre plot of land near the Washington border. It was perfect, isolated, surrounded by endless forest, far from the noise of the world. My boyfriend, now my husband, and I planned to build our dream house there. But for now, we made do with an old camper I picked up for next to nothing. The land, though breathtaking in its beauty, was remote and unforgiving. No electricity, no running water. We relied on a generator, and trips to the nearest town for supplies were a necessity. My boyfriend worked night shifts at a nearby factory, leaving me alone most evenings with only my dog, Ranger, for company. He was a loyal German shepherd, smart and fiercely protective. I always felt safe with him by my side. But that night was different. The forest was eerily quiet. Too quiet. After switching off the generator to save fuel, I sat outside, staring up at the blanket of stars overhead. The beauty of the night was undeniable, but there was an unsettling edge to it. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of animals, were conspicuously absent. Even the wind seemed to have stilled. I felt the silence press in on me like a weight. After stubbing out my cigarette, I retreated inside the camper, the walls of which suddenly felt far too thin against the vastness of the night. Just as I settled under the covers, a sound cut through the stillness. A whistle, soft and faint, drifting from the shadows of the forest. It was no random noise. It was melodic, almost haunting in its simplicity. A sad, repetitive tune that sent a chill crawling down my spine. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it had a pattern. A rhythm. Ranger stood rigid by the door, the fur along his back bristling as a deep growl rumbled from his throat. His eyes were fixed on the darkness outside. I'd never seen him react like this. He was always calm, fearless. But now he seemed on edge, as if sensing something I couldn't. I held my breath, straining to listen. The whistling seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, weaving through the trees, echoing in the still air. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a hunter or a camper passing by. But I knew, deep down, there was no one else out here. And who would be whistling in the dead of night? Ranger's barking cut through the silence, sharp and frantic. My heart hammered in my chest as the whistling persisted, steady and unrelenting, a sound that seemed to taunt my growing fear. I moved to the small window, pulling back the curtain with trembling fingers. The moon cast a pale glow over the forest, but the shadows clung thick between the trees. I saw nothing. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the whistling stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, almost unnatural, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Ranger, however, was still on high alert, growling low as he stalked to the back of the camper, his nose pressed against the small window beside my bed. A strange sensation washed over me, a cold prickle of dread. It felt like something was watching me, standing just outside, staring through that very window. Then I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling the camper. There was no other sound in the forest. No rustling, no chirping insects, just those light, careful steps. Ranger's growls deepened, his body tense, ready to strike. I sat frozen, my mind racing, desperately trying to make sense of it all. The footsteps were too light for any animal I knew, too deliberate for a person. And then they stopped, right beneath the window beside my bed. I sat in suffocating silence, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't bring myself to move, too terrified to even breathe. One thought repeated in my mind, over and over. Was this the warning my grandmother had spoken of? Morning brought little comfort. When my boyfriend returned, I recounted everything. He brushed it off, thinking it was a lost camper, or perhaps a thief. Still, we checked around the area. Beneath the window where I had felt that presence, we found them. Bare footprints, pressed deep into the soft earth. But there was something terribly wrong. There were no tracks leading away. Whoever, or whatever, had stood beneath that window had vanished into thin air. After discovering the barefoot footprints beneath the window, an oppressive sense of unease began to settle over both me and my boyfriend. These weren't just any footprints. They were impossible. No signs of anyone arriving, no traces of someone leaving. The ground was soft, yet there were no other tracks, no logical explanation. We told ourselves it had to be someone lost, a desperate attempt to push the growing horror out of our minds. But deep down, we knew better. We stayed a few more days, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as though something, or someone, lurked just beyond the tree line, waiting. Ranger never left the front door after that night. His growls became a constant sound in the silence of the dark woods, his ears perpetually alert, as if ready to pounce on something unseen. Each evening, the tension inside the camper mounted, a thick, invisible weight pressing down, suffocating. "Anna, open the door." It was my boyfriend's voice, clear, unmistakable, but I knew it couldn't be him. He was miles away, working the night shift. My stomach dropped as the voice called again, "Anna, come outside." But there was something horribly wrong with it. It wasn't just the impossibility of him being there. It was the tone. The way his voice sounded distorted, hollow, like it had been pulled from some cold, distant place. It lacked any warmth or familiarity, only coldness. Ranger let out a low, guttural whine, his body rigid, the hair along his back standing on end. I felt a wave of terror crash over me as I desperately tried to block out the sound, my hands over my ears. But the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent. "Anna, open the door." My mind raced back to my grandmother's warning. Never answer if someone calls your name in the woods. This wasn't my boyfriend. I knew that now. Trembling, I crawled off the bed, gripping Ranger to keep him from charging outside, and huddled in the far corner of the camper. The footsteps outside grew closer, surrounding us, their eerie pace never faltering. My heart pounded in my chest, every second stretching into an eternity of dread. Then came a new sound. A soft, deliberate knocking. Tap. 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 The knock echoed through the thin walls of the camper, slow and measured, as if whoever or whatever was outside knew exactly what it was doing. The tapping wasn't meant to break in, it was meant to break me. The slow, rhythmic sound chipped away at my nerves, each tap drawing out my fear, feeding on it. Ranger's growls filled the silence, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The knocking continued, relentless, until I thought I might scream. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The forest fell into a suffocating stillness, the kind that seeps into your bones and tells you something is horribly, terribly wrong. There was no more whistling, no more footsteps, no more voice calling my name, but I knew they were still out there, watching. I didn't sleep that night. The fear had burrowed too deep. My body locked in a state of constant vigilance, waiting for something to happen. When dawn finally came, I immediately called my boyfriend. He came home in a hurry, and together we searched around the camper once more. What we found chilled us to the core. More footprints, small and barefoot, circling the camper. But these prints weren't like the ones we had seen before. These were smaller, like those of children. They surrounded the camper, perfectly formed in the soft earth. But again, no tracks led away. It was as if they had appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. My boyfriend, who had been skeptical before, was visibly shaken. He muttered something about rumors he'd heard. Strange people living deep in the woods, perhaps a cult or some kind of vagrant group. But we both knew this was something more than that. Why would they mimic his voice? Why the strange, mournful whistling in the dead of night? Then he said something that sent an icy shiver down my spine. Maybe they're not trying to scare us away. Maybe they want to lure you outside. That was it. We couldn't stay another night. We packed up our things, grabbed Ranger, and drove straight to his mother's house in town. I haven't returned to that land since. My boyfriend goes back from time to time to check on the property, but he never stays overnight. Once, a neighbor who lived a few miles away mentioned hearing the same eerie whistling on bright moonlit nights, coming from deep within the woods. He said he had even seen small, shadowy figures standing at the tree line, staring toward his house. His final warning chilled me to the bone. Never go outside when you hear your name being called. Years have passed, but the memories of that night remain vivid. The land we bought, the place where we had planned to build our future, now sits abandoned, untouched. I've come to accept that some places are not meant to be disturbed, that the deep woods hold secrets we are better off not uncovering. And if you ever hear whistling at night, or a voice calling your name from the shadows, whatever you do, never answer. My fiancé, Owen, has always been the adventurous type. If there's a hiking trail, a cliff to climb, or a remote spot to explore, he's the first one there. Me? Not so much. I appreciate nature, but Owen? He's obsessed. So when he suggested a weekend trip to Cedar Hollow, an overgrown, forgotten corner of the Appalachian Mountains, I figured, why not? 3 days of hiking, soaking in nature, maybe some stargazing. It sounded relaxing, at least in theory. For the most part, the trip was perfect. We spent our days winding through deep forest trails, snapping photos, and reveling in the complete disconnection from the outside world. The only unsettling part was how silent it was. No people, barely any animals, just the wind and trees, almost too quiet at times. But Owen was in his element, so I tried not to let it bother me. It wasn't until the last night that things took a strange turn. Owen had this grand idea, a midnight hike to one of the higher peaks. The stars will be amazing, he said, showing me some spot on a map. No light pollution, just pure starlight. I hesitated. The woods at night have always made me uneasy. There's something about how different everything feels, like you don't quite belong there. But he was so excited, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin it. So I agreed. We left the cabin just before midnight, driving up the narrow, winding roads further into the mountain. Owen was humming along to the radio, completely oblivious to how eerie the woods were. Tall trees lined both sides of the road, their twisted branches reaching out like dark, skeletal arms. The headlights cast strange shadows, and every now and then, I swore I saw movement just beyond the beam of light. "It's just the woods," I told myself. "It's late, and I'm imagining things." When we finally reached the lookout point, it was almost pitch black. No stars, no moonlight, just thick clouds hanging low and an odd sudden wind cutting through the trees. The whole place felt wrong. As soon as I stepped out of the car, I was hit by this oppressive feeling, like the air itself was too heavy, too thick. I brushed it off as nerves. Owen seemed fine, so I didn't want to make a scene. I stood by the car while Owen wandered ahead, staring up at the sky, probably hoping the clouds would part. But they didn't. The only thing we had was the wind, howling, pushing at us like it wanted to shove us off the mountain. "I'm just gonna pee real quick," Owen said with a grin. "Then we'll head back." He disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone at the lookout point. That's when it happened. The moment he was far enough away, I felt this overwhelming isolation. The wind grew louder, more insistent, and my skin prickled with unease. Then, I heard it. A sound, faint, but deliberate, coming from the trees to my right. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or coyote, but it didn't sound right. It was too slow, too methodical, like something was creeping deliberately through the underbrush. I turned, squinting into the dark, and that's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a person, a tall, thin figure standing maybe 200 feet away, barely visible in the shadows. But then, it moved. It didn't walk or run. It crumpled, folding down onto all fours in a way that made my stomach twist. Its limbs bent unnaturally, like it was collapsing in on itself, turning into something animalistic. In a fluid, almost horrifyingly smooth motion, it crawled across the ground before leaping over the guardrail and vanishing into the forest below. I stood there, frozen, unable to process what I had just seen. My heart was pounding, but my legs refused to move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back in the car, but I couldn't. I was locked in place, paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, I snapped out of it, bolting toward the car. Owen was still nowhere in sight, but I didn't care. I needed to get away from whatever that thing was. I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. Owen came running back a moment later, confused by my panicked expression. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I couldn't explain it, not coherently. "We need to go. Now." He didn't argue. He must have seen the terror in my eyes, because he climbed into the passenger seat without another word, and I sped down the mountain road faster than I ever had before. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive, but I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing crawling after us. By the time we made it back to the cabin, I still couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something had followed us down from the lookout point. I locked every door and window that night, pulled the curtains tight, and left all the lights on, but I still didn't sleep. The next morning, we packed up in silence. Owen seemed back to his usual self, but I could tell he was on edge. He hadn't asked again what I'd seen, and I hadn't brought it up. I didn't know how to explain it, and maybe he didn't want to know. I didn't blame him. As we drove out of Cedar Hollow, Owen suggested one last stop, an isolated waterfall just off a hidden trail. I wanted to say no, but I didn't. We parked, made the short hike, and all the while, that same oppressive feeling hung over me like a shadow. It was quieter this time, subtler, but it was there, watching, waiting. Halfway back to the car, I stopped. The air around us had grown unnaturally cold, just like the night before. Owen noticed it too. I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see something creeping through the trees, but there was nothing. just the dense, dark woods. But I knew, whatever it wasn't gone. As we finally left Cedar Hollow, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had followed us, that somehow it still was. Hello everyone. I want to share with you a story that happened to me last summer, and I swear it scared me to death. If you're the type of person who easily imagines creepy things, prepare yourself, because this story is anything but light. Last summer, I decided to go camping alone in a remote forest. I know, it wasn't the wisest idea, especially for someone who gets scared easily, but I was exhausted from work and life. I needed time to clear my mind. I found a location through a wild camping app, a perfect spot, quiet, far from the hustle and bustle of the world, with stunning scenery, and most importantly, no noisy neighbors. It was paradise. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sky had started to turn a soft orange as I set up my tent, prepared firewood, and lit the campfire. The scene was peaceful, too peaceful. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, not even the sound of leaves rustling. At first, I thought I was lucky to have found such a quiet corner of nature. But the longer I stared into the encroaching darkness, the more uneasy I became. There was something wrong about the silence, something that made a chill run down my spine. After dinner, I sat by the fire, trying to relax. I watched the flames dance and felt the warmth, convincing myself that camping alone was a good decision. But then the strange sounds began. At first it was faint creaking among the trees, like something was moving. I told myself it could be a deer or a squirrel. But the more I listened, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't the quick, erratic movement of animals. It was slow, steady, circling the campsite. I reached for my flashlight, only to find the battery almost dead. The dim light barely illuminated a few meters ahead. I stood up, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, but the air grew thick, suffocating. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a lost hiker or another camper. But why would they circle the camp in the dark without saying a word? Despite my growing fear, I decided to investigate. I needed to know who, or what, was out there. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped into the woods, following the creaking sounds. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to close in on me. The ground beneath my feet became soft, almost like something heavy had recently passed through. A cold chill crept down my spine as I felt an unseen presence watching me from the shadows. I turned around several times, but there was nothing but darkness. Just as I was about to head back, I froze. Between the trees, a faint shadow. It had a human-like shape, but it was indistinct. A lost figure, barely visible. My heart pounded. I turned and ran back to my camp, my legs moving faster than my thoughts. When I reached the campsite, I was met with a horrifying sight. My tent had been torn apart. The ropes were in a chaotic mess, the tarp dragged far away, and my sleeping bag was scattered. Something, or someone, had been there while I was gone. Fear rose in my chest. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my sleeping bag and retreated into what was left of the tent, barricading myself for the night. Sleep was impossible. Every creak from the forest made my heart race, every sound blending into the memory of those circling footsteps. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each minute more torturous than the last. When dawn finally broke, I packed up and left that forest, not daring to look back. I just wanted to escape. Even after returning home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. For days, I felt like I was being watched. Strange things began happening. My keys would disappear and reappear in places I'd already checked. I heard faint creaks in the house, soft murmurs from empty rooms, and taps on my windows late at night. I tried to dismiss it all, thinking it was just lingering fear from the camping trip. But then, one night, everything changed. It was around midnight. I was lying in bed struggling to sleep. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creaking, like the footsteps from the forest. But this time, they were inside the house. My heart stopped. Ranger, my dog, sprang up, growling into the darkness. These weren't settling noises. Someone, or something, was walking down the hallway, heading toward my bedroom. Then, the softest knock at the door. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, my body locked in terror. The door was locked. How could anyone be there? The knocking stopped, leaving behind a suffocating silence. And then, I heard a voice, my voice, whispering from the other side of the door. Mia, open the door. It wasn't just the sound of my voice. It was distorted, cold, empty, a mockery of my own words. Mia, I know you're in there. Ranger barked and clawed at the door, but I couldn't move. My own voice echoed through the darkness, calling my name again and again. I knew deep in my bones that if I opened that door, something unspeakable would happen. The voice whispered all night, but I never moved. When the first light of dawn finally crept in, the voice stopped. The presence faded. I searched the house, but everything was in place, as if nothing had ever happened. I told my friends, hoping they could offer some explanation. One friend, a psychologist, tried to reassure me, saying it could be the trauma of the forest playing tricks on my mind. But I knew better. Something from that place had followed me home. I researched the area, and what I found chilled me to the core. The forest where I had camped was once forbidden by a native tribe, who believed it was haunted by spirits, lost entities that could mimic voices to lure people to their doom. If you answered their calls, they would drag your soul into their world. The voice still haunts me. Every night I hear that knocking. And now, it's no longer just calling my name. Open the door, Mia. I've waited long enough. No matter how far I run, no matter how much light I keep on, that shadow is still out there, waiting. And I know it will never stop searching for me. Thank you all for listening to my stories. If you enjoyed them, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future videos.